My name is Grechishkin, representing Mount Vernon High School, and I'm presenting the following informative for the Bellevue 2020 tournament. The mind-numbing boredom of quarantine and the isolation caused by COVID has caused all of us to turn to new fads or readopt habits of the past in search of any entertainment we can get. Who hasn't seen a social media post about someone making whipped coffee, baking sourdough bread, or trying their very best to master the newest TikTok dance? However, there's one phase that hasn't made a comeback, yet deserves a second look. It's time we all don our polyester leisure suits and gold chains as we get ready to jungle boogie through the groovy sound of the 1970s. Disco music. By embracing disco as a form of entertainment while we attempt to avoid any Saturday night fevers during this pandemic, we can better understand its unique cultural relevance and see that you and I will survive all this hot stuff. The music we identify as disco first emerged in the early 1970s, as groups like the Monkees and the Beach Boys became phased out in favor of the fresh sound of groups like ABBA and the Bee Gees. Born out of exclusive, membership-only clubs throughout the US and Europe, disco flew below the radar of the general public because of its role as a reaction against the mainstream white rock groups of the time. The term disco was actually first coined when venues in Paris began using turntables instead of live bands to play music for clubgoers in the early 1940s, meaning that some of the world's very first nightclubs were actually considered discotheques. However, disco music as a style didn't emerge until the mid-1960s, when New York clubs began playing music similar stylistically to Eurodisco, uplifting new up-and-coming artists like Jerry Butler. Up until this point, the group disco catered to was exclusive and stayed out of the public eye. But soon, mainstream insight into these secretive venues sparked the disco inferno in the US that we know and love today. In 1971, disco was televised for the first time ever through the Soul Train music and dancing show. And after music critic Vince Aletti began attending the nightclub The Loft, he became enamored with disco culture and was motivated to publish the first ever article about disco in the Rolling Stone, titled Discotheque Rock. This public exposure caused underground clubs to grow to accommodate large crowds, high-tech speakers, and of course, the classic disco ball. Prior to 1970, radio had largely ignored disco as a genre, but by the time 1978 rolled around, there were 200 disco-only radio stations in the US alone. At this point, everyone was saying, "I love the nightlife," resulting in Donna Summer, ABBA, and the Bee Gees topping charts and staying alive in our playlist to this very day. But from its conception, disco has fundamentally been an art form of resistance. The clubs in Europe that laid the groundwork for disco stylistically arose as a form of Nazi resistance, as Hitler continually labeled music created by non-white artists as a degenerate influence. This led to French resistance groups creating secret, hidden nightclubs called discotheques, where music could be played and company could be enjoyed, free of the restrictions of the Nazi Party, effectively turning the beat around. The influence of the discotheque was even prominent within the USSR, where even under Stalin's strict rule, dancing at disco clubs was still permitted. However, the USSR began to freak out as disco culture began to be seen as subversive. DJs became subject to strict regulation, and each dancing event required a reason for the dance to be stated and for the music to be heavily censored by the Communist Party. There was no love train for disco. We remember jazz for the way it amplified black artists in the 1920s, rock for the way that it acted as a movement against mainstream society in the 60s. But when we think of disco, we still think of flashy lights, mass-produced music, and blatant commercialism. Our perception of disco as a mere 70s fad means that we miss out on the nuances of the music and the impacts it's had on our society at large. To begin, the voices of the most popular songs were less masculine and actually, for the first time, were primarily female. Additionally, the club setting of the music meant that singers no longer had to water down their lyrics to make them radio-friendly, allowing singers to deliver potent messages of power and sexuality through music, giving us classics like Shake Your Booty and Do You Think I'm Sexy? This focus on sexuality via music made a dramatic departure from the past, where the few songs that didn't sweep sexuality under the rug entirely were focused on the desire that women created in men. However, artists like Donna Summer re-centered this narrative, instead focusing their music around female pleasure and the power women derive from embracing their sexuality, causing singles like Love to Love You Baby to top charts for months at a time. The empowerment disco fostered arose partially as a result of the victory second-wave feminism had gained in the early 70s, with the ERA gaining traction in the passage of Title IX alongside the Roe v. Wade decision. These newfound changes in attitudes towards femininity and sexuality reflected themselves in disco's fashion scene, where spandex bodywear, wrap dresses, and billowy pants became the must-have pieces. Many feminists denounced disco fashion, labeling it as objectification of the female body. But designers and dancers alike defended their style. Much like the lyrics of the songs themselves, disco fashion was about empowerment for the individual, allowing clubgoers to choose from styles that ran the gamut from modest to revealing. Additionally, disco encouraged a newfound focus on men's fashion, and gave men the freedom to partake in traditionally feminine styles and focus on their appearance free of judgment. Disco uniquely contributed to the empowerment of female artists, as well as a more positive perception of femininity and open sexuality. Additionally, don't stop till you get enough, because disco's unique cultural blend engendered the expression of fresh Black and Latinx artists who became wildly successful after previously being shunned artistically by society. Disco music was rooted in funk music, which was derived from soul, and soon became a critical vehicle in displaying Black culture and uplifting Black singers. Previously, Black music had been thought of as primitive by white society, but the persistent use of Black rhythms in disco, as well as the use of chanted phrases, show the way it diverged from the music of the time and pulled from unique cultural traditions. The physical space disco occupied became a symbol of equality as well. Before disco's popularity, most dancing was restricted to couples dancing between a male and a female, and dancing between two males had actually been outlawed by New York City. However, disco shattered this norm and instead catered to large group dancing, creating a safe space for LGBTQ individuals where same-sex couples were able to dance together and enjoy the nightlife. Clubs like the Saints or the Vatican of Disco claimed spaces and aesthetics that were traditionally heteronormative and turned them on their heads to create clubs that were a safe space for individuals to express themselves and be authentic in a safe area. When examining today's society, the movement has still left its mark. From pioneering the 12-inch single to lengthened dance tracks, disco has in turn contributed to the songs we listen to today being lengthier, giving us all more time to act as dancing queens. Additionally, disco gave rise to DJing as a common practice. Since dance culture was a central component to disco stylistically, DJs matched the music they created to the reactions of the crowd, using unique techniques like listening ahead through headphones to ensure a seamless blend. And the rhythmic undertones, synths, and repetition of the music have all become mainstays and inspiration of the modern-day pop that makes you shake your groove thing. But most importantly, disco amplified the voices of artists whose society overlooked, and created a physical space through dance that was unique, inclusive, and unlike any other. But soon, the tarnish of disco's commercialism led to its last dance. When disco became perceived as popular, it created an influx of white working-class youth into the scene, which subsequently led to the gentrification of the genre. For the most part, LGBTQ and Black artists retained their success, but independent record labels soon became overtaken by saturated music that reflected the commercialism of the time, as well as the disco's audience becoming increasingly heterosexual. The disco sucks movement came to represent the pinnacle of resentment from white rock fans. Rooted in racism and homophobia, the largest known Death to Disco rally was hosted in late July of 1979. At Disco Demolition Night, fans who brought a disco record to be destroyed got a reduced ticket price to see the White Sox play, leading to a crowd of 59,000 attending. Records of not only disco music, but also Black and LGBTQ artists in general were blown up and burned on the field. As journalist Jave March reflected, young white males were the most prominent group in attendance, as they felt most threatened by disco's success. After Demolition Night, the mass production of disco caused the music to be seen as oversaturated and cheap. It became aired less and less on the radio as the months went on. However, the downfall of disco led to artists to shift towards new forms of music, like boogie music and house that birthed modern-day Latin freestyle, techno, electronica, and EDM. Today, disco rarely makes an appearance on the odd radio throwback, and sometimes will show up on a playlist. Other genres of music still get recognition for the footprint they've left on society. And yet, most of us still perceive disco as superficial, tacky music, overlooking all the complexities and cultural value it holds. Instead, we should take a chance on meaningful disco music and see how it allows us to progress as individuals and society. Because once we realize that we are family, it's all a boogie wonderland.